It was a bitterly cold evening, the kind of night when the streets seemed deserted, abandoned to the whims of the biting wind. The sun had long set, casting the small suburban neighborhood into the kind of darkness that felt endless. Carol had been working late again, caught up in a whirlwind of paperwork that had made her lose track of time. Now, as she walked home, she regretted leaving the office so late. The streets were eerily quiet, with only the occasional gust of wind stirring the barren trees. Her breath misted in front of her face as she quickened her pace. The soft crunch of snow beneath her boots was the only sound breaking the silence. She hugged her coat tighter around her body and shifted her gaze ahead, where the distant glow of her home beckoned. It wasn't until she was halfway down the block that she felt it, an unsettling prickle at the back of her neck, a sense that she wasn't alone. The sensation was so strong that she instinctively turned her head, scanning the shadows behind her. There, about 30 meters away, was a man. He was walking alone, his head slightly tilted downward, his features mostly hidden beneath a dark hood. Carol's heart leaped in her chest. She wasn't typically paranoid, but something about the man's presence made her uneasy. He was too close for comfort, and though there were no other pedestrians, no cars, no signs of life nearby, he seemed to move with deliberate intent, his pace steady but slow. A sudden wave of fear rushed through her. Without thinking, she quickened her steps, her heart thumping loudly in her ears. The man was still far enough away, but the distance between them didn't comfort her. She glanced back again, hoping, praying, that she was overreacting. The man was still there, his pace matching hers. He wasn't running, wasn't sprinting, but his deliberate steps seemed to echo louder in her mind. Carol felt a knot form in her stomach, her pulse racing. She was about 200 meters from home now, but it felt like an eternity away. The shadows seemed to press in around her, the biting cold forgotten, as the pounding of her heart drowned out everything else. She heard it then, footsteps behind her. At first, she thought it was the pounding in her chest, but no, they were distinct, growing closer. He was following her. Fear surged through her, cold and sharp. She broke into a near run, her legs pumping harder as the distance to her house seemed to shrink and stretch at the same time. She dared not look back again, too afraid of what she might see. The sound of his footsteps had vanished, or maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. Finally, her house came into view. Relief washed over her as she fumbled with her keys, her hands trembling. She jammed the key into the lock, swung the door open, and rushed inside. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she slammed the door shut behind her, twisting the deadbolt with a satisfying click. For a moment she stood in the entryway, listening, waiting for something, anything, but the house was still. The street outside was silent. Carol took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. She turned back to the door and hesitantly peered through the peephole. Nothing. The street was empty. She let out a shaky laugh. Maybe she had imagined it all. The cold, the dark, the isolation. They could make anyone's mind play tricks. She shook her head, feeling a little silly, and turned back toward the warmth of her living room. As usual, she made herself a cup of tea and settled on the couch, flicking on the TV in an attempt to distract herself from the lingering unease. But as she sat there, sipping her tea and watching the flickering images on the screen, the sensation returned. That strange, prickling feeling at the back of her neck, the one that made her feel like she wasn't alone. The hairs on her arms stood on end, and her heart began to race again. It was irrational. She was inside her home, safe. She had locked the door. There was no one here but her. Yet the feeling persisted, gnawing at her nerves, pulling her attention away from the TV. And then she remembered the man. His face had been obscured, his movements too calculated, too focused. Something had been wrong with him. She couldn't explain it, but it was as if his presence carried a weight, an undeniable malice that lingered long after he had disappeared from her view. She glanced around the room, her eyes settling on the large window that overlooked her front yard. That's when she froze. Outside the window, standing perfectly still, was the man, her breath caught in her throat. He was standing right there, staring into her house. His face was partially illuminated by the dim glow from the streetlight, but what she saw made her stomach turn. His face was pale, almost sickly, but it was the wounds that terrified her, jagged cuts and deep gashes that marred his skin, as if something had torn at him with claws. His lips were twisted into a grotesque smile, a long, terrifying grin that made her skin crawl. Carol couldn't move, she couldn't scream. She could only stare, paralyzed with fear, as the man stood there, smiling at her through the window. Finally, her body jolted into action. Her hand shot for her phone, fumbling as she dialed 911, her fingers trembling so violently that she almost dropped it. The operator's calm voice on the other end felt surreal, as if she were in a dream. "There's a man," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Outside my house. He's watching me." "Stay calm, ma'am," the operator said. "We're sending help right away. Stay on the line." But Carol wasn't calm. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the man outside, from that terrible grin and those vacant, hollow eyes. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there like a statue, watching her, waiting. Minutes felt like hours as she sat frozen, the phone clutched to her ear, her gaze locked on the man. Every second was unbearable. The fear was suffocating. Finally, the sound of sirens broke the tension. Red and blue lights flashed outside as a police car pulled up in front of her house. 2 officers stepped out, and Carol watched as they scanned the yard. The man, he was gone. One of the officers approached the door, knocking gently. Carol stood on shaky legs, her body still trembling as she let them in. "He was right there," she stammered, pointing toward the window. "He was standing outside, just watching me." The officers exchanged a look before stepping outside to search the perimeter. They were gone for several long minutes before one of them returned, shaking his head. "There's no one out there, ma'am. No footprints in the snow either." Carol felt a cold wave of confusion wash over her. No, that's impossible. He was right there. I saw him." The officer gave her a sympathetic look but remained firm. "We've checked all around the house. There's no sign of anyone being here." Carol's mind raced. How could that be? She had seen him plain as day, standing in the snow right outside her window. There should have been footprints. There should have been some trace of him. The officers were about to leave when one of them hesitated, glancing down at the floor near the window. "Hold on," he said, frowning. Carol followed his gaze and felt her heart stop. There, just a few feet from where she had been sitting, were faint, wet boot prints, prints that hadn't been there when she came in. Her stomach twisted in horror as the realization hit her like a cold, brutal wave. The man hadn't been outside. He had been inside her house, standing behind her the whole time, and what she had seen in the window was his reflection.